Mom asked me to stop my vows to spare my sibling who got ditched beforehand. I said no and left them off the guest list. Mom asked me to stop my vows to spare my sibling who got ditched beforehand. I said no and left them off the guest list. Mom asked me to stop my vows to spare my sibling who got ditched beforehand. I said no and left them off the guest list. Emily, a 30-year-old woman, was deep into planning her long-awaited December wedding with her fiancé Ryan. The couple had been organizing the event for nearly a year, carefully choosing a date right in the heart of the Christmas season, knowing how hectic it could get and wanting to be ahead of the rush. Everything was going smoothly until her mother stepped in with a request that left her stunned. Emily's older sister, Julia, had recently suffered a painful heartbreak. Her fiancé had abandoned her just moments before their own wedding ceremony. The ordeal had left Julia devastated, and now their mother was pressuring Emily to cancel or postpone her wedding altogether, to spare Julia the emotional pain of watching her younger sister get married so soon after her own failed attempt. Emily couldn't believe it. Her wedding date had been set long before Julia even got engaged, and all the arrangements had already been made. Yet her mother insisted that moving forward with the wedding would be insensitive and might reopen Julia's emotional wounds. Not long after Emily and Ryan announced their engagement, things with her sister Julia took a strange turn. Julia, who was 3 years older and had been single for a while after a quiet divorce, suddenly began dating a new guy. Within just a few months, she announced that she, too, was getting married. The timing felt suspicious. Julia had only been with this man, someone barely in his mid-20s, for about 5 or 6 months. Emily couldn't help but wonder if her sister was rushing into things just to beat her down the aisle. Out of concern, she gently asked Julia if she was sure about the relationship. But instead of taking it kindly, Julia snapped back with a snide remark. "Not everyone has the luxury of a perfect relationship." Emily let it go. Julia's wedding plans were modest, a small church ceremony with fewer than 20 guests. The groom claimed his parents couldn't make it on short notice since they lived overseas, and only a couple of his friends and a colleague were invited from his side. But on the actual day of the wedding, things fell apart completely. He didn't show up. Julia and their father tried calling him again and again, but there was no response. Eventually, a text came in. He said he wasn't ready to get married, that he just wasn't sure. Julia was devastated. She tried reasoning with him, suggesting they take more time and continue the relationship instead of ending it abruptly, but he ignored her completely and never replied again. Since that heartbreaking day, Julia has changed. She's been distant, cold, and quietly resentful toward Emily, almost as if blaming her younger sister for her own failed wedding. Emily never said, "I told you so," never rubbed it in. In fact, she tried to be there for Julia, but Julia didn't want her there. She even asked Emily to leave when she was at her lowest, and from that moment on, the warmth between them seemed to vanish entirely. As the wedding date inched closer, the tension in Emily's family escalated. One day, out of the blue, Julia called her. Emily thought maybe she was finally ready to make peace or offer congratulations, but the call was cold and brief. Julia simply asked, "So, you're really going through with this outdoor venue?" Emily replied with a cheerful yes, only to be met with a flat, "Cool," before Julia hung up without another word. Emily brushed it off, until the next evening, when her mother called. Her tone was serious. She urged Emily to tone down the wedding, explaining that the celebration was upsetting Julia. By toning down, she meant canceling the venue, ditching the outdoor theme, and opting for a small registry office ceremony with a minimal guest list. According to her mother, having a joyful, picturesque wedding so soon after Julia's heartbreak would be disrespectful. Emily was stunned. She calmly reminded her mother that the wedding had been in the works for over a year. Every family member, including her mom and Julia, had known about the December plans well in advance. Most of the expenses had already been paid, over 60% of the venue, food, and decorations. Canceling now would mean losing thousands of dollars, none of which were refundable, but her mother wasn't having it. She dismissed the financial loss and insisted that canceling the wedding was the right thing to do. When Emily pushed back, pointing out how unreasonable it was to sacrifice her dream wedding, her mother turned the conversation around. "If you could postpone the wedding once for Ryan's work trip, why can't you do it again for your sister?" she said. "If you really loved her, you would." Those words cut deep. Emily felt like she was being emotionally blackmailed. Her mother was trying to guilt-trip her into believing that putting Julia's comfort above her own happiness was the only way to prove her love as a sister. It was manipulative, it was cruel. Emily hung up feeling shaken and conflicted. She had spent months planning this day, her day, and now she was being asked to erase it just to protect someone else's fragile pride. After the emotionally charged conversation with her mother, Emily couldn't help but question herself. Was she really being selfish? Should she have postponed the wedding again? Was she blind to her sister's pain? These doubts ate away at her for days, and to make matters worse, Ryan, always the gentle, empathetic type, suggested that perhaps they could simplify the wedding, just to ease the tension. He wasn't trying to take sides, but his compassion toward Julia made Emily feel even more isolated. For the first time, she started to feel like maybe she was the villain, but then she stepped back and really thought about it. This wasn't about insensitivity, this wasn't about timing, this was about Julia being jealous, and their mother enabling it. The more Emily reflected, the clearer it became. Growing up, things weren't always perfect, but they weren't horrible either. Sure, she used to joke that their mom favored Julia. After all, Julia was the sweet one, always by their mother's side, always part of the family gossip and gatherings. Meanwhile, Emily had always been more independent. She threw herself into academics, focused on scholarships, and moved out at 18 to attend college far from home. While Emily built her life on her own, Julia stayed close to the nest. She lived with their parents until she was 25, only moving out when she got married the first time. Even then, she moved just a few miles away and spent every other weekend at their mom's place. And after their father passed away 5 years ago, Julia moved back in with their mother entirely. That bond between Julia and their mom had only grown tighter, while Emily remained more of an outsider. It wasn't necessarily toxic back then, just distant. But now, with everything happening, Emily could see the pattern. Her mother was used to prioritizing Julia's comfort even at the expense of fairness. And Julia? She was used to being the center of attention. Seeing Emily succeed, finding love, preparing for a joyful wedding, was triggering something deep in Julia. Not sadness, not grief. Jealousy, and that wasn't Emily's burden to carry. Emily had a bad feeling when her mother invited her and Ryan over for dinner. It wasn't a casual, friendly invitation. Her mother had called earlier, acting uninterested while asking about the wedding, almost as if the entire event was just some silly idea Emily hadn't given up on yet. Then came the follow-up. "Why don't you come home? We can sit and talk." Emily declined the first offer. But not long after, her mother called Ryan directly. She told him she just wanted to cook them a homemade meal and catch up, nothing serious. Ryan, ever the kind-hearted soul, agreed. Before they left for dinner, Emily pulled Ryan aside. She knew how easily he could get pulled in by emotion and guilt. She warned him, "If they bring up the wedding again, don't say anything. Don't make promises. I'll handle it." Ryan agreed. At first, things went smoothly. Julia wasn't there, which brought Emily a bit of relief. Her mother made dinner and the conversation was light. Until it wasn't. Out of nowhere, her mom started talking about her own wedding, how she and Emily's late father got married at the registrar's office and had a humble lunch afterward. She went on about how the money they saved helped them build their life together, hinting heavily that Emily and Ryan were being frivolous with their own plans. Then she turned to Ryan. She suggested they cut costs and scale back because there's a long life ahead of you two, and money should be saved for what really matters. Emily calmly responded that their wedding was already modest for what they earned, and that they lived a very basic lifestyle by choice. Still, her mother pushed harder, now claiming that humble weddings were a family tradition. That's when Emily had had enough. She pointed out that Julia's first wedding had over 100 guests and a huge celebration. That wasn't exactly humble. Her mother brushed it off, saying it was their father's idea. He wanted to see at least one of his daughters have a proper wedding. Then, the emotional manipulation began. Her mother started crying, saying how much she missed Emily's father, how painful it was that he wouldn't be around for this one. Ryan, naturally empathetic, stood up to comfort her. Emily signaled him not to get sucked in, but it was clear he was torn between both women. And then Julia appeared. She swept in with dramatic flair, rushing to her mother's side, playing the role of the dutiful daughter. Through crocodile tears, she said she'd always stand by their mom and would never do anything to disrespect her wishes. Unlike others. That was it. Emily had had enough. After months of subtle digs, emotional blackmail, and being painted as the villain in her own story, she snapped back. "Yeah, it's just one of it," she said. "But it's the most important day of my life, and unlike others, I plan to do it once." The jab was direct, and Julia immediately understood it was about her 2 failed engagements. It was harsh, but Emily didn't regret it. She was done playing nice, done pretending she hadn't been hurt too. She wasn't just defending her wedding. She was defending her right to happiness. After the exhausting dinner with her mother and sister, Emily found herself emotionally drained, but strangely more certain than ever. She wasn't backing down. That night, Ryan sat her down and gently talked things through. He wasn't siding with Julia, but he wanted to understand all angles. He suggested a compromise. What if they moved the ceremony to a quiet church and reduced the guest list, especially the extended family? Maybe Julia was more afraid of gossip and judgment than the wedding itself. Emily considered it. While she didn't love the idea of shrinking her wedding, she also realized she didn't have much of a connection with many of her aunts and uncles anyway. She even called her cousin, someone notorious for spreading family gossip, to try and get a read on how others were feeling. What she heard confirmed her gut. This wasn't about shame or whispers. This was about control. Julia and their mother were trying to manipulate the situation, and some family members were clearly buying into it. Others, thankfully, weren't. So Emily and Ryan made their decision. They would move forward exactly as planned. A garden-themed wedding with around 70 close friends and loved ones. They had spent months designing a celebration that reflected their personalities, intimate, joyful, and genuine. Emily wasn't going to let bitterness rewrite her story, but Julia wasn't finished. Word got around that the wedding was still happening as originally planned, and Julia lost it. She started sobbing in front of their aunts, claiming that Emily was being cruel, deliberately twisting the knife by getting married in front of her, as if it were some kind of revenge. Emily was dumbfounded. I'm not marrying her ex. I'm not ruining her life. I'm just living mine, she thought. She even tried to talk to Julia one last time, tried to urge her to be happy for her. But Julia wasn't interested in healing. Instead, she clung tighter to the role of the victim, painting Emily as the heartless sister obsessed with a party, not realizing it was never about the wedding. It was about being seen. Soon Emily began receiving calls from different family members, her godmother included, telling her gently that she was doing nothing wrong, that she had every right to celebrate her love, especially after so much planning. Some of them had seen through Julia and their mother's behavior, and that support meant everything. But the pain lingered. Julia left Emily a voicemail full of venom, calling her arrogant, spoiled, and selfish. It cut deep, the kind of hurt only family can cause. Emily couldn't believe this was what her relationship with her sister had come to, just a week before her big day. The one time she hoped to feel surrounded by love, she was instead caught in the crossfire of someone else's bitterness. As the wedding day drew closer, things took an even darker turn. Emily's phone buzzed one night with a voicemail from Julia. She almost didn't listen, but curiosity got the better of her. What she heard left her shaken. Julia didn't hold back. She called Emily a spoiled brat, accused her of flaunting her happiness, and claimed that she was deliberately trying to hurt her. There wasn't a hint of warmth or understanding, just bitterness. It wasn't just the words, it was the venom in her voice. The voicemail ended with Julia saying she hoped Emily would one day feel the same kind of pain she had. Emily sat in silence afterward, her chest heavy. This was her sister, the same girl she used to share bunk beds with, the same person she once looked up to. Then, as if that wasn't enough, an email from her mother landed in her inbox the next morning. It was cold and formal, like a letter written to a stranger. Her mother told her she was disowning her, that she was deeply disappointed in the woman Emily had become, that she was choosing to side with Julia and would not be attending the wedding. She even went as far as to write, "If you go through with this, don't consider me your mother anymore." Emily was stunned. Her hands trembled as she read and reread the message. How had things escalated so far? Was celebrating love really such a crime? Ryan tried to comfort her, but Emily was numb. She had expected resistance. She hadn't expected exile. But then, 2 days before the wedding, something unexpected happened. Emily's phone rang again. It was her mother. Her first instinct was to let it go to voicemail. But something inside told her to answer. To her surprise, her mother didn't sound angry. She sounded tired, soft, vulnerable. There was something in her voice Emily hadn't heard in a long time. Remorse. She asked Emily if they could meet, just the two of them, for coffee. Emily hesitated, her guard up. But curiosity and a quiet hope led her to agree. When they met, her mother looked older than she remembered, worn down, not by time, but by grief. She apologized, not in a half-hearted way, but sincerely. She admitted she had been wrong, that she had let her grief over Julia's failed wedding and the lingering sadness over her late husband cloud her judgment. She said she loved both her daughters, but in her desperation to protect one, she had hurt the other.
Emily listened in silence. Her mother didn't ask her to change anything. She didn't guilt her. She simply asked for a chance to be part of the wedding again. For the first time in weeks, Emily felt something she hadn't felt toward her mother in a long time: compassion. Maybe this wasn't just about a wedding. Maybe it was about healing wounds that had been festering for years. Sitting across from her mother at that small coffee shop, Emily felt the weight of years, of old wounds, distant silences, unspoken favoritism, all rise to the surface. Her mother's apology wasn't perfect. It didn't erase the pain of the past weeks or undo the emotional toll of being called selfish, arrogant, and unloving, but it was sincere, and that sincerity cracked open something in Emily she hadn't expected: the desire to forgive. After their conversation, Emily spent the night in quiet reflection. She talked with Ryan, who gently supported her no matter what she chose. The anger she had clung to for weeks began to fade, replaced with a sense of calm resolve.
She made her decision. The wedding would go on exactly as planned. A garden-themed celebration with the people who truly loved and supported her. But she would also allow her mother to attend, not as a reward, not because everything was suddenly fixed, but because this could be the start of something new, a chance to begin healing a fractured family instead of letting it completely fall apart. Emily realized that moving forward didn't have to mean cutting ties forever. Sometimes it meant drawing boundaries and leaving the door open just enough for something better to grow. She wasn't doing it for appearances. She wasn't doing it to please anyone. She was doing it for herself. For peace, closure, and maybe, just maybe, reconciliation.
The big day finally arrived, and it was everything Emily had hoped for and more.
The garden venue was bathed in soft natural light, the late morning sun peeking through delicate white canopies, with flowers in soft hues lining the aisles like whispers of celebration. The entire scene felt like something out of a dream. Simple, heartfelt, and utterly personal. Around 70 of their closest friends and family had gathered, people who mattered, people who showed up, not just physically but emotionally. The love in the air was palpable. As Emily walked down the aisle toward Ryan, she locked eyes with him. He wasn't just smiling. His eyes were glistening, brimming with emotion. In that moment, everything else faded: the drama, the tension, the battles. All that existed was the two of them and this promise they were about to make. Their vows were raw and real, spoken through tears and soft laughter. Even the usually reserved Ryan choked up. There wasn't a dry eye in the front row.
Then, quietly, something unexpected happened.
Among the wedding gifts and decorations near the family photo display, Emily spotted a bouquet, elegantly wrapped in soft lavender paper, her favorite color. Tucked inside was a small card with Julia's handwriting. The message was simple but powerful. "I know I wasn't ready to be there, but I hope today brings you all the happiness in the world. Congratulations, Em." Emily stood still, reading it once, then again. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was something, a start, an acknowledgement.
She placed the bouquet next to the framed photo of their late father, two absent family members who, in very different ways, still had a presence on this day.
As the music swelled and laughter rose from the reception, Emily felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. As the evening sky faded into twilight and lanterns floated gently into the air, each carrying a wish, a blessing, a quiet goodbye, Emily stood hand in hand with Ryan, watching their wedding day come to a perfect poetic close. But as she stood there in her wedding dress, surrounded by people laughing, dancing, and celebrating, her mind wasn't just on the vows, the flowers, or the music. It was on the journey that had brought her here. Because this day, this beautiful, intimate, emotionally charged celebration, wasn't just about two people getting married. It was about surviving a storm and still choosing joy. It was about setting boundaries without shutting doors and choosing love, not just in her relationship, but in how she viewed the people around her, even the ones who had hurt her. Emily thought of Julia's bouquet, of her mother's teary apology, of her own decision not to cancel or compromise her happiness just to keep the peace. She had fought for this day, not just for the venue, the guest list, or the details, but for the right to feel joy without guilt. Now, standing in the glow of the celebration, she felt something powerful: gratitude.
Gratitude for the people who stood by her. Gratitude for Ryan, who had never let her carry the weight alone. Gratitude even for the pain, because it had shown her how strong she really was.
And most of all, she felt hope. Hope that this wedding would be more than a memory, that it would be a turning point, that maybe one day she and Julia could rebuild their bond, that maybe her mother meant it when she said she wanted to make amends, and that from this day forward, her new family, built on honesty, love, and mutual respect, would be stronger than the chaos that tried to pull it apart. As the last lantern disappeared into the night sky, Emily smiled. She had married the love of her life.
But more than that, she had reclaimed her own